Okay, this is the first of our fraction operations video. So this video is going to be for adding and subtracting fractions. So make sure you add fraction operations to your table of contents. Should be right under decimal operations. And these notes are going to be on pages 14 through 17. Now, go ahead and flip over to page 14. So it should be right after. Went too far. You did your last, notes over decimals. And we're going to start with adding fractions. Okay, the main thing that you need to remember when you're adding fractions is you must have a common denominator. So that means the denominators of both or all the fractions you are adding together must be the same first. So that's my little start point. Okay, and then we have the steps. So the first thing you want to do is find that least common denominator if your denominators are not the same. And your least common denominator is exactly the same as the least common multiple. So you should remember back in about 5th grade or so, you learned to find common multiples. Okay, after we find our least common denominator, we're going to rewrite equivalent fractions using the least common denominator. Our next step, since our denominators will be the same, we're now ready to either add or subtract. But we only add or subtract the numerators and the whole numbers. Your denominator stays the same. I repeat, denominator stays the same. Do not add or subtract denominators. And of course, the last step in dealing with fractions is always to simplify if possible. Okay, and a lot of times when you're adding, you may end up with an improper fraction after you finish adding. So make sure you turn all improper fractions back to mixed numbers. Okay, let's look at our first example. Okay, in this example, we are doing 9 7/9 plus 6 1/3. Now, I always like to line my fractions up one on top of the other. So I've rewritten it right here. So notice my color coding. My pink step is where I'm going to be finding the least common denominator. Now in this first one, you should see the denominators are 3 and 9. So you should be thinking, well, 3 goes into 9 evenly. So therefore, 9 should be the common denominator. But just in case we list multiples, so you see right here where I've listed multiples for 3 and 9, and the smallest one that they have in common is the 9. So that's why this 9 has become our numerator for both fractions. Now remember, to make equivalent fractions, whatever you have to multiply by the denominator, or the denominator by to get your new one, is what you're going to multiply your numerator by. So if your denominator changes, your numerator changes. One of the common errors that I see students doing on this step is you'll change your denominator, but you'll still have a 1 here for your numerator. Well, that doesn't make sense. There's no way that these two can be the same and these two be different. And since this 9 stayed the same, then that means this 7 will stay the same. And don't forget to move your whole numbers over as well. So now that we have the same denominator, all we need to do is add. So I'm going to add the 7 plus the 3. And that's where the 10 comes from. Notice my denominator is still 9, and 9 plus 6 is 15. Now since I do have an improper fraction right here where this 10/9 is, I need to simplify that to a mixed number. So 9 goes into 10 one time, and there's 1 left over. So that makes a mixed number of 1 1/9. I'm going to take that and add it back to the 15. So technically, I'm just adding the 15 plus the 1, and the 1/9 stays my fraction. So final answer is 16 1/9. Okay, in this second example, we're going to subtract fractions this time, but it's the same exact steps. So notice I have lined up my fractions, put one on top of the other. I've come down here and found the common denominator of 6 and 4. So the smallest number that they have in common in the multiples is 12. So now I'm going to take this 12 and I'm going to make new fractions with the denominator of 12. So that's where these 12s come from. to fill in the rest, 4 times 3 is 12. So I come here and multiply the 3 times the 3, which is where my 9 comes from. Since 6 times 2 gave me 12, I had to multiply 5 times 2 to get my new numerator, which is 10. Move your whole numbers over. Now you're ready to subtract. And final answer is 2 1/12. And normally when you're subtracting fractions, once you do the subtraction, your answer is typically simplified. And notice we subtracted the 10 minus the 9 to get the 1. Denominator stayed the same. Okay, the other thing I want to show you is regrouping to subtract fractions. So this should be on page 15. Now what I mean when I say regrouping to subtract fractions, this is the same as like when you have like 250 minus 172. So if I write that down and we look at it, and you really don't have to write this down, you can see that you cannot take 2 from 0. Neither can you take 7 from 5. So we would have to borrow and regroup. So this is the same thing. My pencil's not writing very well. So sometimes you have to do the same thing with fractions. If your second fraction is larger than the first one, then you don't have enough to take away from, so you're going to have to regroup. So in order to regroup a mixed number, because it pretty much has to be a mixed number in order to be able to subtract, you're going to take 1 from the whole number and you're going to rewrite it as a fraction. So if we're taking 1 away, then that fraction has to equal 1. So remember, fractions that equal 1 have to have same numerator and denominator, such as 2 over 2, 10 over 10, 50 over 50. And it tells us we're going to use the denominator that's already there. Because remember, you have to have the same denominator in order to add or subtract fractions. Okay, this right here is telling you to follow these same steps as on the previous page. So we're really doing it exactly the same as we did on page 14. There's just one additional step. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. In our first example, we're doing 6 1/4 minus 1 3/5. You should be able to look at this 1/4 and this 3/5 and tell 3/5 is larger than 1/4. So I'm going to start out with the same steps. First, I'm going to find my least common denominator. Then I'm going to take that denominator and write my equivalent fractions. Now from there, when I get ready to subtract, I've got 5 minus 12. I can't take 12 away from 5. So therefore, I've got to regroup. There's no way that that's going to be 7 because that's a negative 7. And we don't want a negative numerator. So when I regroup, this 6, we're going to take 1 away from it, which is where the 5 comes from. Now I want this to still equal 6 altogether. So I need to add it back, add that 1 back as a fraction. This 20 over 20 equals 1. So technically all of this is still 6. And the reason why I use 20 is because my denominator is already 20. So now since this is 6 5/20, I already have my 6 here. I need to add the 5/20 back. So this takes me to 5 25 over 20. So basically this is the exact same as this. They are equivalent in value. Now I'm going to slide over the bottom fraction, 1 12/20. Now I can subtract because 25 is larger than 12. So I can take 12 from 25, which gives me 13. Denominator stayed the same. 5 minus 1 is 4. And there's your final answer. It's already simplified. That's not so hard, is it? Okay, in my second example, this time we have a whole number and we're trying to take a fraction away from it, or mixed number. Well, I've got to have a fraction in order to take a fraction from it. So since there is no fraction right here, I need to regroup this in order to get a fraction. So since my denominator is already 4, I'm going to use that same denominator. So first I take 1 away from 5 and make 4. Since I need to have all of this over here equal 5 total, then I need a fraction that equals 1. So using the 4 as the denominator, I'm going to make a fraction that equals 1, which is 4/4. So again, all of this in total is equal to 5, which is the same as what's right here. Now slide over the 2 3/4, and you can take 3 from 4. So 4 minus 3 is 1. Denominator stays 4. 4 minus 2 is 2. Now, if you don't like regrouping, then your alternative method, which is this little box right here, is to change your fractions to improper fractions first. So change mixed numbers to improper fractions first. That way, you'll end up with your top fraction being large enough to subtract the bottom fraction from it. And whenever you do that, you'll always have to simplify in the end. So that means you're going to either have to convert back to a mixed number, and sometimes you'll have to simplify your numbers in general. Okay, guys, this is our video for adding and subtracting fractions. If you have any questions, please make sure you write them down and be ready to ask when you come into class on Monday. And I do apologize for it taking so long. I'm not the most technologically savvy person, but I'm learning.